Vienna, winter, 1692. A palace built for emperors holds its breath. A young woman, barely 23, lies dying in silence. Outside, bells wait to ring. Inside, her arms a newborn boy sleeps, a child whose life could decide the fate of Europe. History will remember the war, but it will forget the woman who almost stopped it. The winter air of Vienna pressed down upon the Hofburg palace like an unspoken weight. Snow covered the rooftops and streets, dulling the city into silence. Carriages moved slowly across the frozen cobblestones, their wheels echoing faintly through the night. Inside the palace, candlelight flickered against stone walls that had witnessed centuries of power, prayer, and loss. In one chamber, a young woman lay weakened by childbirth. Maria Antonia of Austria, daughter of an emperor, mother of an heir, breathed shallowly beneath heavy blankets. Her skin was pale, her strength fading, her body consumed by fever. Beside her, a fragile candle struggled against the dark. In her arms, only hours before, had rested her newborn son, Joseph Ferdinand, alive, breathing, a miracle Europe had waited decades to see. Outside that room, courtiers whispered of dynasties saved. Inside, a life was slipping away. To understand how Maria Antonia reached this moment, we must return to her beginning, because her end was written the day she was born. She entered the world on January 18, 1669, within the Hofburg Palace itself. Vienna lay wrapped in snow. The Danube ran slow and cold. Bells rang in celebration as a daughter was born to Emperor Leopold I and his Spanish wife, Margaret Theresa. She was given many names, Maria Antonia Josefa Benedicta, but from her first breath, she carried something heavier than titles. She carried history. The palace into which she was born was not merely a home. It was a symbol. Its corridors were lined with portraits of ancestors whose faces revealed a truth few spoke aloud. Long jaws, pale skin, hollow eyes, the visible marks of centuries of intermarriage. The House of Habsburg had built its empire not through conquest alone, but through blood. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece, again and again. The strategy had preserved crowns, but it had come at a cost. Children were born weak. Infants died before their first steps. Women faded in childbirth. These losses were accepted as the price of power. Maria Antonia was born into that bargain. Her father, Emperor Leopold, was devout and disciplined, a man who believed his dynasty ruled by divine will. Her mother, Margaret Theresa of Spain, was both his wife and his niece, herself fragile, pale, already weakened by the same bloodlines she passed on to her children. From the beginning, Maria Antonia's life belonged to the dynasty, not to herself. She did not grow up surrounded by siblings. One by one, the children born before and after her died within days. Bells rang for baptisms and funerals in the same week. Maria Antonia survived, and because she survived, expectation tightened around her. At 4 years old, she lost her mother. Margaret Theresa died at just 21, her body exhausted by childbirth. For Maria Antonia, the loss was incomprehensible. One day there was a gentle voice, a familiar touch. The next, silence. A child cannot understand dynastic sacrifice. She only understands absence. From that moment, her childhood hardened. She was raised by attendants and stepmothers who themselves did not last. One died, another followed. Maria Antonia learned early that women in her family came into the palace only to disappear. Love was brief, loss was permanent. Still, she grew, quiet, observant, serious beyond her years. Her education was relentless: Latin for prayer and law, French for diplomacy, Spanish for inheritance, music for refinement, embroidery for patience. Every skill was a preparation, not for happiness, but for usefulness. Portraits were painted while she was still a child. Her image was sent across Europe, examined by men who discussed her health, her posture, her potential. She was evaluated like territory. Because while Maria Antonia played quietly in palace gardens, another figure haunted her future: her uncle, Charles II of Spain. He was the living embodiment of the dynasty's decay, physically frail, mentally impaired, childless. His empire stretched across continents, yet his body could barely sustain itself. Everyone knew his reign would end without an heir, and when it did, Europe would burn. Maria Antonia was his closest legitimate blood relative. She did not know it yet, but the eyes of Europe were already fixed on her. If forgotten lives like this matter to you, stories history almost erased, subscribe. These chapters deserve to be remembered. By the time Maria Antonia reached childhood, her fate was no longer a question of if, but how. She would be married, she would be used. Her body would be asked to do what generations before her had failed to do: produce survival where decline ruled. The bells of the Hofburg rang on, marking hours, ceremonies, deaths. To most, they were routine. To Maria Antonia, they were a warning. Because the dynasty that raised her was already dying, and she had been born to delay its end. By the time Maria Antonia reached the age when childhood begins to blur into awareness, the palace around her had already decided what she was meant to become. Not a woman, not a daughter, but an answer. Spain was unraveling. Across the continent, in the dim halls of Madrid, her uncle, Charles II, sat upon the most fragile throne in Europe. His empire stretched from the Americas to the Mediterranean, yet his body barely sustained him. His jaw hung heavy and misaligned, his limbs trembled, his mind wandered. Physicians failed him, priests surrounded him, and still no heir came. Every year without a child sharpened the fear. If Charles died without issue, Spain would fracture. France waited hungrily. Austria trembled at the thought of Bourbon power expanding unchecked. Diplomats whispered, maps were redrawn in candlelight, and always the question returned to the same place: Vienna, the Hofburg, the emperor's daughter, Maria Antonia. She was still a child when the unthinkable was first spoken aloud. She should marry her uncle. To modernize, the proposal is grotesque. To the Hofburg court, it was only tradition carried one step further. Cousins had long married cousins, uncles had married nieces before. The dynasty had survived by folding back into itself again and again, ignoring nature's warnings. What mattered was blood. What mattered was control. Charles was 15. Maria Antonia was 6. She could not understand the meaning of marriage, let alone the implications of such a union. Yet her name traveled across Europe sealed in wax, attached to proposals discussed by men twice removed from consequence. In Vienna, her daily life continued unchanged on the surface: lessons in languages, music practice, prayer, embroidery. But something shifted in the air. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms, eyes lingered on her longer. Her tutors became stricter, her movements more controlled. She sensed, without understanding, that her life was no longer her own. The proposal disturbed even those accustomed to Habsburg customs. Spain hesitated. Ministers worried not only about morality, but about survival. Charles needed an heir quickly. A child bride could not provide one soon enough. In the end, Spain refused. Charles II was married instead to a French princess, young, healthy, capable of bearing children immediately. The engagement to Maria Antonia dissolved quietly, without ceremony. To Europe, it was a practical decision. To Maria Antonia, though she would not fully grasp it later, it was the first time her body had been offered up to save an empire, and it would not be the last. The collapse of that plan did not free her. It merely delayed her fate. As she grew older, suitors were discussed not in terms of affection, but geography: Savoy, Bavaria, strategic borders, military leverage. Each name represented a possible future, each future chosen without her voice. She was trained to accept this. Obedience had been woven into her upbringing as tightly as prayer. When the final decision came, it was Bavaria. Maximilian II Emanuel, Elector of Bavaria, was ambitious, energetic, admired across Europe. His land sat at a critical crossroads of power. A marriage to him would bind Bavaria firmly to Austria and, more importantly, strengthen Maria Antonia's claim to Spain through her children. She was 16 when the decision was finalized. The wedding preparations unfolded with splendor, gowns stitched with silver thread, jewels selected for symbolism as much as beauty, portraits painted to announce the alliance to foreign courts. Maria Antonia stood at the center of it all, composed and silent. She did not cry. She did not resist. She did what she had been raised to do. The journey from Vienna to Munich marked the first true severing of her life. Carriages carried her westward across frozen roads, away from the palace that had shaped her, toward a court she did not know and a husband she had barely met. Munich greeted her with ceremony and noise, feasts, music, celebration. Maximilian Emanuel was everything she was not: charismatic, extroverted, confident. Where she moved carefully, he moved boldly. Where she listened, he commanded. At first, Europe celebrated the match. It looked strong on paper, but paper does not live inside marriages. Very quickly, Maria Antonia understood what she had been given to. Her husband delighted in attention, he loved spectacle, he loved pleasure, and he did not hide his infidelities. Women appeared at court openly, whispers followed him through halls. Maria Antonia endured in silence. Raised in the strict restraint of Vienna, she had been taught that dignity was survival, that public composure mattered more than private pain. She learned this lesson deeply. She withdrew inward. Her role became performance: smile when required, appear when summoned, speak only when spoken to. Behind closed doors, she lived alone. The court noticed. Observers described her as intelligent, serious, melancholy. They admired her poise even as they sensed her isolation. She was present, but never truly seen. And still, the dynasty demanded more, because marriage was never the end. It was only the beginning. If you're still listening, subscribe. These are the lies history uses and then forgets. As the months passed, pressure mounted for what mattered most: an heir. Her body, once again, became the focus of hope. The empire waited. Marriage did not soften Maria Antonia's life. It sharpened it. In Munich, The court glittered with noise and indulgence, tournaments, banquets, music that lasted deep into the night. Maximilian Emmanuel thrived in this atmosphere. He was admired, envied, celebrated. He wore ambition easily, like a second skin. Maria Antonia did not. She moved through these spaces quietly, her presence formal rather than warm. Where her husband laughed loudly, she spoke softly. Where he commanded attention, she endured it. Their differences were not complementary, they were isolating. And isolation, over time, becomes its own kind of wound. The court noticed her silence and misread it. Some called her cold, others called her proud. Few understood that she had been trained from childhood to disappear behind dignity. Emotion, she had learned, was dangerous. Her husband made no effort to understand her. Maximilian's affairs were not rumors whispered in corners. They were visible, undeniable. Mistresses appeared openly at court, rewarded with attention Maria Antonia never received. The humiliation was public and deliberate. She did not protest. She did not confront him. She absorbed it, because that was what Habsburg women did. Yet beneath the silence, pressure mounted. A marriage without heirs was failure, and Maria Antonia knew better than anyone what failure cost women in her family. Her mother had died young, her stepmothers had followed, her siblings had vanished before learning to walk. Now the dynasty watched her body. When news spread that she was pregnant, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Hope returned, cautious, fragile, restrained. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold prayed daily. In Madrid, ministers calculated futures. In Munich, courtiers spoke more softly around her, as though careful not to disturb destiny itself. Maria Antonia felt the weight immediately. Pregnancy did not bring her comfort, it brought fear. She had seen what childbirth did to women like her. She had lived among graves small enough to be carried in one arm. She knew that survival was not guaranteed. Still, she endured. Her first labor came in 1689. The palace prepared, midwives assembled, physicians waited with remedies that could do little. Outside the chamber, men whispered prayers and predictions. Inside, Maria Antonia fought through pain alone. When the moment came, the room fell silent. The child, a son, was stillborn. No cry, no movement, only absence. The bells rang, but not in celebration. For Maria Antonia, the loss was not merely grief, it was confirmation of a fear she had carried since childhood, that her body might be unable to do what history demanded of it. She did not rage, she did not collapse, she mourned quietly. The court offered sympathy, but it was already looking forward. One child lost was tragic, 2 would be unacceptable. Within a year, she was pregnant again. This time, the hope was more restrained. Whispers replaced prayers. No one dared assume success. In 1690, she gave birth again. The child lived for days, long enough to be baptized, long enough to be named, long enough for hope to rise and be taken away. The bells rang again. For Maria Antonia, the sound had become familiar. It marked the end of expectation, the collapse of fragile joy. Each toll echoed backward into her childhood, into memories of siblings she never knew, into the image of her mother fading away after childbirth. History was repeating itself inside her. And still she endured. Maximilian Emmanuel offered no comfort. His attention drifted easily back to pleasure, to ambition, to the life that did not include her grief. His neglect was no longer surprising, it was routine. Maria Antonia retreated further into herself. Observers described her as pale, reserved, distant, but they also noted her intelligence, her composure, her quiet authority. She did not complain, she did not shame her husband publicly, she fulfilled her duties with precision. To the court, she was admirable. To herself, she was exhausted. Then came another change, another displacement. Maximilian was appointed governor of the Spanish Netherlands. Brussels would become their new residence. Once again, Maria Antonia was uprooted, carried away from whatever fragile familiarity she had formed. Brussels was tense, politically unstable, a crossroads of power contested by Austria, France, and Spain. Maximilian relished the challenge. Maria Antonia found only further isolation. The losses followed her. The humiliation followed her. But so did expectation, because despite everything, despite stillbirth, despite loss, she remained the key to Spain's future. Her uncle, Charles II, still lived, still childless, still failing. Every year he survived prolonged the crisis. Every year he declined sharpened the need for an heir elsewhere. That heir could only come through her. She knew this, and knowing it made the next pregnancy unbearable with fear. She prayed more fervently than ever, not for herself, but for the child she might carry, not for happiness, but for survival. If you're still here, subscribe. This is where history stops being abstract and becomes human. Her health declined. Repeated pregnancies weakened her. Grief hollowed her. Loneliness pressed down on her like stone. Yet she remained composed, as though dignity itself were keeping her alive. Those who saw her wrote of a woman already marked by sorrow, despite her youth. She was barely 20, yet carried herself like someone much older. And then quietly, decisively, she made a choice no one expected. She left. In 1691, Maria Antonia returned to Vienna alone. It was an act of defiance disguised as illness. She cited her failing health. Others whispered of humiliation and despair. The truth likely contained all of it. She could no longer endure. Vienna received her not as a bride, but as a daughter returned, changed, diminished, yet still burdened with expectation. Her father welcomed her, her stepmother offered comfort, but even here she could not escape her role. Because fate had not finished with her body yet. She was pregnant again. And this time, everything would change. Vienna did not celebrate Maria Antonia's return. It watched her. When she arrived back at the Hofburg in 1691, she was thinner than when she had left. Her movements were slower. Her eyes carried a heaviness that no ceremony could disguise. To some, she appeared ill. To others, defeated. To the dynasty, she was still necessary. Her pregnancy was acknowledged carefully, almost cautiously, as if speaking of it too loudly might invite disaster. Physicians examined her endlessly. Midwives hovered. Priests prayed over her daily. Every measure was taken, though few truly understood how fragile she had become. Maria Antonia understood. She felt the weakness in her bones. She felt the exhaustion settle into her chest. She felt fear, not sharp, but constant, a quiet certainty that her body might not survive another trial. Yet she did not speak of it. She had learned long ago that her pain was irrelevant. What mattered was the child. As winter closed in on Vienna, Europe waited. Letters crossed borders faster than armies. In Madrid, ministers calculated futures they dared not announce. In Paris, Louis XIV watched closely, measuring how long Austria could hold the Spanish inheritance from him. In Munich, Maximilian Emanuel waited impatiently, hoping the child would secure his own influence. And in Vienna, Maria Antonia carried all of it inside her. Labor began in early 1692. The palace was sealed, guards stationed, physicians summoned. Prayers filled every chapel. Bells were prepared, not to ring yet, but to stand ready. Inside the birthing chamber, Maria Antonia labored for hours. Her strength faltered early. Fever burned through her veins. The physicians whispered among themselves, their expressions tight. This birth would decide everything. Then, at last, a cry, a sound that had been absent too many times before. A living child. Joseph Ferdinand was born alive. The room froze in disbelief before exploding into motion. Midwives wept openly, priests crossed themselves, physicians stepped back as if afraid to touch him. Outside the chamber, the bells finally rang, not in mourning, but in relief. Across Europe, the reaction was immediate. This child changed everything. Joseph Ferdinand carried Habsburg blood through his mother, Bavarian power through his father, and Spanish legitimacy through his lineage. He was the compromise candidate, a solution acceptable to all major powers. For the first time in decades, Europe exhaled. Treaties were drafted around his existence, negotiations softened, war plans paused. The War of the Spanish Succession, once inevitable, was delayed. Peace, fragile but real, settled over the continent. Maria Antonia had done what generations before her could not. But victory came at a cost her body could not afford. Within days, her condition worsened. The fever intensified. Infection spread. Something modern medicine could easily cure, but 17th century physicians could only pray against. She grew weaker by the hour. Visitors were restricted. Her son was kept from her bedside to protect him from illness. Nurses fed him carefully, guarding him as if the future itself rested in the cradle. Because it did. Maria Antonia drifted in and out of consciousness. In her lucid moments, she asked only about the child. Was he breathing? Was he warm? Was he alive? She did not ask about herself. On December 24th, 1692, Christmas Eve, Maria Antonia of Austria died. She was 23 years old. No grand announcement accompanied her passing. Europe was too busy celebrating what she had accomplished to mourn the cost. Bells rang for the birth of peace, not for the woman who had paid for it with her life. She was buried quietly, a daughter of emperors, a mother of hope, gone before most had learned her name. Her son survived, and for a time that was enough. Joseph Ferdinand grew under careful watch. Every cough was monitored, every fever recorded. He was educated gently, shielded from excess, protected as the most valuable child in Europe. Because his survival meant stability. Diplomats spoke of him as though he were already king. Agreements were signed with his future reign in mind. France hesitated. Austria held firm. Bavaria dreamed of influence. For 7 years, Europe remained balanced on the fragile health of a boy. And during those 7 years, Maria Antonia's name faded. She was remembered briefly as a mother, rarely as a political force. History began, as it often does, to simplify her, reducing her to a footnote beneath the child she produced. But peace is not sustained by hope alone. Disease does not respect treaties. In 1699, smallpox reached the child. Physicians rushed in desperation. Prayers filled the palace once more. The same bells that had rung in relief now waited again, silent and heavy. Joseph Ferdinand died at 6 years old. With him died the compromise. The future collapsed. If you're still here, subscribe, because this is where the silence breaks and history turns violent. The balance shattered instantly, the treaties unraveled, the patience vanished, the ambitions long restrained surged forward. Europe no longer had a child to wait for. Maria Antonia had delayed catastrophe. She had not stopped it. For 7 fragile years after Maria Antonia's death, Europe lived in a suspended moment, one that felt almost unreal. The continent moved carefully, as though afraid that a single wrong step might shatter the balance. Diplomats spoke softly. Kings delayed decisions. Armies remained restless but restrained. All of it hinged on the survival of one child, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. He grew beneath layers of protection no other child had known. His meals were inspected, his tutors monitored, his physicians summoned at the slightest sign of illness. Windows were sealed against drafts, visitors were restricted, even play was controlled for fear that injury or exhaustion might weaken him. Because this boy was not just a child, he was a treaty. Every breath he took postponed war. In court correspondence, his name replaced entire paragraphs. His health reports were read like battlefield updates. When he caught a mild fever, anxiety spread across borders. When he recovered, relief followed. The future of Spain and Europe had been reduced to a single fragile life. Yet, despite the precautions, Joseph Ferdinand lived as a child only briefly. He was educated early, taught the languages of courts that expected to claim him. He learned manners before games, duty before curiosity. He was never told outright what he represented, but he sensed it. Children understand weight even when they cannot name it. Observers described him as bright, gentle, and physically strong. Unlike so many Habsburg heirs before him, he did not appear sickly. His body, at least, seemed spared the worst consequences of dynastic blood. This gave Europe hope. In 1698, formal agreements were signed. Spain would pass to Joseph Ferdinand upon Charles II's death. France reluctantly accepted the compromise. Austria consented. Bavaria stood to gain unprecedented influence. Peace at last appeared possible. And then, quietly, something ancient and unstoppable entered the story: smallpox. It did not announce itself with drama. It never does. It arrived as fever, as spots, as weakness. Physicians were summoned immediately, their faces tightening as they recognized the signs. The same helplessness that had haunted Maria Antonia's childbirth returned. Smallpox did not care about bloodlines. It did not respect treaties. It did not pause for history. For days the child struggled. The palace filled once again with prayer. Bells remained silent, as though afraid to speak too soon. But this time, there was no miracle. On February 6, 1699, Joseph Ferdinand died. He was 6 years old. Across Europe, the reaction was instant and irreversible. Letters that had carried hope now carried dread. Courts that had prepared for peace began mobilizing for conflict. The compromise was gone. The delicate balance Maria Antonia had purchased with her life collapsed in a single moment. There was no replacement.
Spain's king, Charles II, was still alive, but barely. His body was failing rapidly. His mind was unreliable. And now, with Joseph Ferdinand gone, the question returned with renewed violence. Who would inherit Spain? France moved first. Louis XIV saw his opening. He pushed the claim of his grandson, Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince. Austria countered with its own candidate, Archduke Charles. Alliances formed, old grudges resurfaced, borders hardened. Europe did not slide into war, it lunged. Within a year, the War of the Spanish Succession ignited, a conflict that would consume the continent for more than a decade. Battles stretched from Spain to Italy, from the Low Countries to the seas. Cities burned, economies collapsed, generations were scarred. And beneath it all lay a haunting truth. None of it was inevitable. For 7 years, peace had existed, not perfect, not permanent, but real. It had existed because Maria Antonia's son had lived. She had not been powerful in the way kings are remembered. She had not commanded armies or signed treaties. She had not spoken from thrones. She had endured. She had survived humiliation, loss, and isolation. She had given birth under impossible odds. She had died quietly, without recognition. And in doing so, she had bought Europe time. History rarely counts time bought as achievement. Maria Antonia's name faded further as war consumed attention. Chroniclers focused on generals, kings, treaties, victories. Her story was reduced to lineage charts and footnotes. Yet every battlefield echoed with her absence. Every casualty traced back to the moment her child died. Because the war that followed was not caused by ambition alone. It was caused by the collapse of the only compromise Europe had been willing to accept. Maria Antonia had been that compromise. Her body had carried it. Her death had sealed it. Her son had embodied it. And when he was gone, nothing remained to hold the continent together. If you believe history should remember the people it uses, not just the wars it celebrates, subscribe. Charles II of Spain would die the following year, in 1700. When he did, there was no heir acceptable to all sides. The decision he left behind, naming a Bourbon successor, ensured war rather than peace. The moment passed, the chance was lost. And the woman who had almost saved Europe was already buried. When Charles II of Spain finally died in 1700, his body gave out much the same way his dynasty had, slowly, painfully, and beyond repair. He left behind an empire without a universally accepted heir, and with that, Europe plunged into chaos. The War of the Spanish Succession tore across the continent for 13 brutal years. Kingdoms bled for borders. Armies marched for claims written in ink long before the men carrying muskets were born. Cities were reduced to ash. Entire regions were emptied by famine, disease, and exhaustion. It was one of the most destructive conflicts Europe had ever known. And yet, beneath the banners and battle reports, there was a quieter truth that history rarely pauses to acknowledge. This war did not begin because no solution had existed. It began because the one solution that had existed was gone. Maria Antonia of Austria had been that solution. She never ruled Spain. She never wore its crown. She never issued decrees or commanded armies. But through her body, through a single fragile life, she had done what diplomats, kings, and treaties could not. She had held Europe still. For 7 years, the continent waited. For 7 years, ambition hesitated. For 7 years, violence was postponed. That pause was not accidental. It was purchased through sacrifice, through endurance, through a woman whose name would later fade from memory. History remembers wars vividly. It remembers those who delay them far less. Maria Antonia's story did not end with recognition. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no cities named for her, no grand historical rehabilitation. As the war dragged on, chroniclers focused elsewhere, on generals like Marlborough and Eugene of Savoy, on treaties like Utrecht, on victors and losses. She became a footnote, a lineage reference, a genealogical bridge, a means to explain why Joseph Ferdinand existed at all. But history's forgetfulness does not erase consequence. Every casualty of the war that followed existed because the pause she created had ended. Every ruined village marked the moment when compromise failed. Every treaty signed in blood echoed the silence left behind when her son died. Maria Antonia had not failed. Her body had done exactly what the dynasty demanded at the cost of her life. She had produced peace, briefly. She had delayed catastrophe. That delay mattered, even if it was not permanent. Yet women like her are rarely granted credit for what almost happened. History favors outcomes, not near miracles. She lived in a world where her worth was measured in heirs, where her suffering was invisible so long as she remained composed, where her death was accepted as collateral. She was not allowed anger. She was not allowed refusal. She was not allowed legacy. And yet, her life left a mark, not a visible one, not a celebrated one, but a structural one. The very fact that Europe had once been willing to accept compromise tells us something important. The continent did not want war. It was dragged into it only when the fragile balance she created disappeared. That balance existed because of her. Maria Antonia's story challenges how history assigns importance. She did not change the world through conquest or command. She changed it through endurance, through being used, through surviving long enough to matter, through dying quietly after doing what no one else could. Her silence is not evidence of insignificance. It is evidence of how power often works. The lives most critical to stability are often the least remembered. The people who absorb pressure so others can move freely are rarely thanked once they break. Maria Antonia broke, and Europe moved on. But if we look closely, if we trace events backward instead of forward, we see her everywhere. In the treaties drafted around her child, in the years of peace that followed her death, in the violence that erupted once her contribution could no longer hold. She did not stop history. She redirected it, briefly, delicately, at enormous cost. And that matters. If stories like hers deserve space in your memory, subscribe. History is more than battles. It's the lives that held them back. Maria Antonia of Austria died believing she had finally done her duty. She never lived to see the war she delayed. She never knew how close Europe had come to avoiding it entirely. She vanished into silence. But the silence she left behind was loud enough to change everything. History will always remember the war, but now you remember the woman who almost stopped it, and that, quietly, changes the story.